The sound of dirt hitting a coffin should mean the end, but sometimes it's just the beginning. The first clump of earth landed with a hollow thud, echoing across the manicured cemetery like a quiet drumbeat no one wanted to acknowledge. And Angela Brooks stood perfectly still beside the polished mahogany casket, her black gloves folded tightly in front of her as 200 guests dressed in designer grief shifted uncomfortably under the gray California sky, their whispered condolences floating in the air like smoke that never quite settled. But Angela didn't hear any of it because just behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of breath near her ear, a voice cut through everything, low and controlled and far too calm for a funeral. Speed up the inheritance. I'm putting her next. And for a single second the world seemed to pause, the wind stopping mid-breath, the murmurs fading into nothing, and Angela didn't turn around, didn't gasp, didn't react, because after 30 years of marriage into the Brooks family, she had learned one thing better than anything else. Control was survival. So instead she kept her eyes on the coffin as if mourning her husband Daniel, a man who had been alive just 10 days ago, a man whose sudden passing had already raised quiet questions that no one dared to say out loud, a man whose young wife Vanessa now stood just steps away preparing her performance, and Angela's fingers tightened slightly inside her gloves as she felt the faint vibration of her phone recording in her coat pocket, capturing every word, every breath, every secret that wasn't meant to be heard. And then the shift happened right on cue as Vanessa stepped forward into the center of attention, her heels clicking softly against the stone path, her face already glistening with perfectly timed tears as she reached for the microphone placed near the gravesite, her voice trembling just enough to convince the audience. Daniel was everything to me, she said, pausing as if the grief was too heavy to carry, and a ripple of sympathetic murmurs moved through the crowd, heads nodding, hands covering mouths, people believing exactly what they were supposed to believe. But Angela watched closely. Not the tears, not the words, but the spaces in between, the moments where Vanessa's expression went still, almost blank, as if she were calculating rather than remembering. And somewhere in that stillness Angela felt it, a quiet certainty settling into her chest like cold steel, because grief had a rhythm, a weight, a truth to it. And this wasn't it. This was something else entirely, something rehearsed, something practiced. And as Vanessa continued speaking about love and loss and forever, Angela slowly exhaled, her gaze never leaving the coffin as another clump of dirt struck the wood below, because in that moment, she understood something no one else at that funeral could even imagine. This burial wasn't closure, it was a cover, and whatever had just been whispered behind her wasn't grief speaking. It was a plan, and for the first time since Daniel's death, Angela Brooks wasn't just a widow standing at a grave. She was a witness standing at the beginning of something far more dangerous. The guests began to disperse in slow, careful movements, like actors exiting a stage after the final scene, their polished shoes crunching softly over gravel while black umbrellas opened against a sky that threatened rain but never quite delivered. And Angela Brooks remained where she was long after the last condolence had been offered, her posture still composed, her expression unreadable, because she understood something no one else did, that whatever had just been buried was not the only truth lying beneath the surface. And as the cemetery emptied, Vanessa's voice echoed faintly behind her again, lighter now, almost relieved, speaking quietly with one of the family attorneys about timelines and paperwork and numbers that should never be discussed within earshot of fresh soil. Yet there it was, efficient, organized, controlled, and Angela finally turned, just slightly, enough to catch a glimpse of her daughter-in-law's face no longer softened by grief, but sharpened by something colder, something focused. And in that fleeting moment Vanessa noticed her, their eyes meeting for less than a second before Vanessa's expression shifted instantly, like a switch being flipped, returning to sorrow, to fragility, to the version of herself the world expected to see. And Angela gave nothing in return, no acknowledgement, no reaction, only silence, because silence was the only advantage she had left, and she intended to use it carefully. That night the house felt too large, too quiet. The kind of quiet that made every small sound feel deliberate, the ticking of the antique clock in the hallway, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant echo of footsteps that were no longer there. and Angela sat alone in Daniel's study, a room that still carried his presence in the scent of old leather and cedarwood. Her phone resting in her hand as she pressed play for the first time, the audio crackling softly before the words emerged again, clear, unmistakable. Speed up the inheritance. I am putting her next, and Angela did not flinch this time, did not pause. She listened all the way through, then again and again, until the tone, the cadence, the intention embedded itself into her memory with absolute certainty. This was not a misunderstanding, not grief speaking out of turn. This was deliberate, calculated, and planned. And as she lowered the phone, her gaze drifting to the framed photograph on Daniel's desk, a picture taken just 2 weeks earlier at a charity event where he had looked healthy, composed, even optimistic. She felt the first crack in the official story begin to widen, because nothing about his sudden passing had made sense then, and now it made even less. And across the hall a door closed softly, followed by the faint sound of Vanessa moving through the house, her footsteps steady, unhurried, as if she had already stepped into a future she believed was guaranteed. And Angela remained seated in the dim light, her mind moving carefully, methodically, connecting pieces that had once seemed unrelated, the change in Daniel's schedule, the quiet meetings, the documents he had started reviewing but never finished. And for the first time since the funeral, Angela allowed herself to consider a possibility she had been avoiding, that her husband's death was not simply an ending, but the beginning of something far more deliberate. And somewhere in the stillness of that house, one thought settled in with absolute clarity. Vanessa was not afraid, which meant she believed she was safe, and that belief, Angela realized, was the one mistake she intended to prove wrong. Morning arrived without warmth, the pale light slipping through the tall windows of the Brooks estate as if it did not belong there, and Angela Brooks had not slept, not even for a moment, because sleep required trust, and trust had quietly disappeared sometime between the funeral and the replaying of that whisper. And now every detail felt sharper, louder, more intentional, from the way the coffee machine clicked on at exactly 6:30 to the soft sound of footsteps descending the staircase with measured confidence. And Angela did not need to look up to know it was Vanessa, because there was something unmistakable about the rhythm, steady, unhurried, like someone who believed the future was already secured. And when Vanessa entered the kitchen, she wore a simple black dress, understated, respectful, the kind of image that suggested mourning without inviting questions. Yet her eyes were alert, calculating, scanning the room in a way that did not match the role she was playing. "You are up early," Vanessa said gently, her voice smooth, controlled, as she reached for a glass of water, and Angela met her gaze briefly before returning her attention to the newspaper spread neatly across the table, untouched. "So are you," Angela replied, her tone even, neutral, revealing nothing. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching thin but not breaking, until Vanessa offered a faint, sympathetic smile, the kind that was meant to comfort but instead felt rehearsed. "There is a lot to handle today. The attorney will arrive at 10. We should go over the documents together," she said, as if discussing routine business, as if the house had not just lost its foundation. And Angela nodded slowly, as if considering something ordinary, while inside her mind every word was being measured, tested, placed into a pattern that was beginning to form, because Daniel had always handled the legal matters himself, had insisted on privacy, had postponed discussions about inheritance more than once. Yet now Vanessa spoke of timelines with certainty, with expectation, as if she already knew how everything would unfold. And that certainty did not come from grief. It came from preparation. And Angela folded the newspaper carefully, aligning the edges with deliberate precision before setting it aside, her movements calm, controlled, mirroring the discipline she had relied on for decades. "Of course," she said quietly, "it is important we do things properly." And Vanessa's expression softened again, satisfied, reassured, as if Angela's compliance confirmed what she had already assumed, that the older woman was overwhelmed, distracted, incapable of seeing beyond the surface. And as Vanessa turned away, reaching for her phone, Angela's eyes followed just long enough to notice the quick glance at the screen, the subtle shift in posture, the faint tension in her shoulders that disappeared just as quickly as it came. And in that brief moment, Angela understood something new, something precise. Vanessa was not only planning, she was coordinating, and whatever came next was already in motion. And as the clock on the wall ticked toward 10 o'clock, each second marking the approach of the attorney and the reading of documents that might confirm everything or reveal nothing at all, Angela rose from her chair with quiet resolve, because she had already made her decision sometime before dawn. She would not confront, she would not accuse, she would not reveal what she knew. Not yet. Instead, she would listen, observe, and let Vanessa continue believing she was in control. Because control, Angela realized as she walked toward Daniel's study, was not about acting first, it was about acting at the right moment. And that moment was coming faster than anyone else in that house could possibly see. The attorney arrived exactly at 10 o'clock, not a second early, not a second late, as if time itself had been instructed to behave, and Michael Carter stepped into the Brooks estate with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent decades navigating rooms filled with power and secrets, his tailored navy suit immaculate, his leather briefcase held with precise control. And Angela watched him closely from the far end of the living room, noting the way his eyes moved, quick but subtle, taking in details without appearing intrusive, while Vanessa greeted him first, her voice soft, composed, offering condolences that sounded practiced yet appropriate. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," she said, her hand resting lightly against the back of a chair as if she needed support, and Michael nodded respectfully, his expression professional but not detached. "It is my responsibility to ensure everything is handled correctly," he replied, his tone steady, measured, and as he turned toward Angela, there was a slight pause, almost imperceptible, as if he recognized something beneath her calm exterior that others had missed. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, offering a brief incline of his head, and Angela returned the gesture with equal restraint, her eyes holding his just long enough to suggest awareness without revealing intention, and within minutes they were seated in Daniel's study, the air heavier now, more deliberate, as Michael opened his briefcase and carefully removed a set of documents bound in clean, structured order, the sound of paper against wood unusually loud in the quiet room, and Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her attention focused, her posture composed but expectant, as if she had been waiting for this moment long before it was appropriate to do so. "Your husband made several updates to his estate in the past month," Michael began, his voice clear, controlled, and Angela felt the first shift in the room, subtle but undeniable, as Vanessa's expression flickered for just a fraction of a second before settling again. "These updates include adjustments to asset distribution and specific conditions regarding the transfer of ownership," he continued, sliding the first document forward, and Angela did not move immediately, instead allowing the silence to stretch, watching Vanessa from the corner of her vision as she reached for the papers with a careful hand that was just slightly too quick, just slightly too eager, and as Vanessa scanned the page, her eyes moving, line by line, Angela noticed it again, that momentary stillness, that pause where something did not align with expectation, and it was gone almost instantly, replaced by a composed nod. "Daniel always believed in clarity," Vanessa said softly, offering a faint smile that did not reach her eyes, and Michael observed her for a brief second longer than necessary before continuing. "There is also an audio directive attached to the final amendment," he added, placing a small digital recorder on the desk, and for the first time since the meeting began, the atmosphere shifted completely, the quiet tension sharpening into something more defined, more fragile, as Vanessa's hand stopped mid-motion, her fingers hovering just above the page, and Angela felt it too, the subtle tightening of the moment, because audio meant intention, meant direct words that could not be reinterpreted or softened, and as Michael reached for the device, preparing to play the recording, Angela leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady, while inside her mind every detail aligned with growing clarity, because whatever Daniel had left behind was not just a document, it was a message, and as the room fell into complete silence, the faint click of the recorder powering on sounded far louder than it should have, marking the beginning of something none of them could control. The click of the recorder seemed louder than it should have been, a small, mechanical sound that carried weight far beyond its size. And for a moment, no one moved. Not Angela, not Vanessa, not even Michael Carter, whose hand hovered just above the device as if he understood that once the voice began, nothing in that room would remain the same. And then it started, Daniel Brooks' voice, calm, measured, unmistakable, filling the space with a presence that felt almost physical. "If you are hearing this, it means I was not given the time I expected," he said, each word deliberate, controlled, and Angela felt her chest tighten slightly, not from grief but from recognition, because this was not a message of farewell, it was a message of preparation, and across the desk Vanessa remained perfectly still, her expression composed, her eyes fixed on the recorder as if willing it to say something else, something predictable, but Daniel's voice continued, steady and clear. "Over the past few weeks, I have made several changes to my estate, not out of fear, but out of necessity." And there was a pause, brief but intentional, the kind that suggested careful thought rather than hesitation. "There are matters within this household that do not align with what they appear to be," he added, and Michael's gaze shifted subtly between the two women, observing without interrupting, while Angela did not move at all, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her breathing even, her attention absolute, because every word confirmed what she had already begun to understand. And then Daniel spoke again, his tone unchanged but somehow sharper. "To ensure clarity, all primary assets will remain under conditional control until a full review of my final weeks is completed." And that was the moment the air in the room changed, not dramatically, not visibly, but undeniably, as Vanessa's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the document in front of her, a small movement that might have gone unnoticed to anyone else. But Angela saw it clearly, the first fracture. In a carefully maintained composure, and Daniel's voice continued, "No transfers, no distributions, and no decisions regarding inheritance are to be finalized until this review is concluded." And the silence that followed felt heavier than any sound, stretching across the room like an invisible weight pressing down on every surface, every breath, every thought. And Michael slowly reached forward, pausing the recorder with the same controlled precision he had shown from the moment he entered the house. And for a few seconds no one spoke, because there was nothing simple left to say. And then Vanessa exhaled softly, a measured breath that seemed calculated to restore balance. "Daniel was always cautious," she said quietly, her voice steady, almost reassuring, as if she were explaining something ordinary, something expected. But Angela turned her head just slightly, her gaze resting on Vanessa with a calm that held no accusation yet carried undeniable awareness. And in that silence something shifted between them, subtle but irreversible, because for the first time Vanessa was no longer entirely certain of the narrative she had been following, and Angela, without raising her voice, without changing her posture, had stepped into a different role entirely, not a grieving widow, not a passive observer, but someone who now held a piece of truth that could not be undone. And as the clock on the wall ticked quietly forward, marking each second with steady precision, one realization settled firmly into place. Daniel had known, and whatever he had suspected had been serious enough to stop everything. And now the question was no longer whether something was wrong, but how far it had already gone. No one rushed to speak after the recorder clicked off, because the silence had already said too much, and Angela Brooks could feel it settling into the room like a quiet pressure that no one could ignore, not anymore. While Michael Carter slowly closed his briefcase halfway, not fully, as if he understood this meeting was no longer routine, no longer just about documents and signatures, and Vanessa shifted in her chair, just slightly, a controlled movement that might have passed for discomfort, but carried something sharper underneath, something calculating. "A review can take time," she said carefully, her tone measured, almost practical, as though she were guiding the conversation back to safer ground. "Weeks, sometimes months, depending on what is required." And Michael nodded once, acknowledging the point without agreeing to it. "That is correct," he replied, his voice steady. "But until that process is complete, no assets can be accessed or transferred." And there it was again, that pause, that fraction of a second where Vanessa's composure tightened before smoothing out once more, her gaze dropping briefly to the documents before returning to neutral. And Angela watched everything, every detail, every breath. Because patterns were forming now, clearer, sharper, impossible to ignore, and what she saw was not grief navigating uncertainty. It was strategy adjusting to disruption, and that difference mattered more than anything else in that moment. "Of course," Vanessa said softly, folding her hands together as if accepting the situation with quiet strength. Daniel always valued structure, and Angela almost allowed herself a small, silent recognition of the precision in that statement, because it was true. Daniel had valued structure, but he had also valued control, and control was exactly what he had just taken away. And as the conversation shifted into procedural details, timelines, documentation, formal language that filled space without revealing intention, Angela's attention moved elsewhere, not away, but deeper, focusing on the edges of the room, the things that did not belong, the subtle inconsistencies that had once seemed insignificant. And then she saw it, just for a moment, as Vanessa's phone lit up on the table beside her, a message preview appearing before the screen dimmed again. Too quickly for anyone else to notice, but long enough for Angela to catch the single word that stood out against everything else: delay. And something inside her mind locked into place with quiet certainty, because delay was not a reaction. It was an instruction, and instructions meant coordination. And coordination meant this was never a single action, never a single moment. It was a sequence, already in motion long before the funeral, long before the whisper, long before Daniel's voice had been preserved on that recorder. And as Michael gathered the documents and stood to leave, offering formal reassurances about the process ahead, Vanessa rose with him, her movements smooth, controlled, her expression once again composed into the role she needed to maintain. But Angela remained seated for just a second longer, her gaze steady, her thoughts aligning into something far more deliberate than suspicion, because now she understood the shape of what she was facing: not chaos, not grief, but a plan that had been interrupted, not stopped. And as she finally stood, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, one realization settled firmly into place: whatever Vanessa had started was still moving forward, just more carefully now. And if Angela wanted the truth, she would have to step into that movement without being seen, without being expected, because the next mistake would not come from rushing it, would come from someone believing they still had control, and Angela intended to let that belief continue just long enough to reveal everything. The house settled into a quiet that no longer felt empty but watchful, as if every wall had begun to listen, and Angela Brooks moved through it with deliberate calm, her steps unhurried, her expression unchanged, because by now she understood that nothing in this house was random anymore. Every word, every movement, every silence carried intention, and as she passed the hallway mirror, she caught her own reflection, composed, steady, almost detached, and for a brief moment, she recognized the shift within herself. Grief had not disappeared, but it had been replaced by something sharper, something that required focus rather than emotion. And down the hall she heard Vanessa's voice, low and controlled, speaking on the phone behind a partially closed door. The tone different now, stripped of performance, efficient, precise. "No, it has been delayed," Vanessa said quietly, pausing as if listening. "I told you, the conditions changed, we need to adjust." And Angela did not stop walking, did not hesitate, because hesitation would reveal awareness. And awareness was the one thing she could not afford to show. So she continued past the door, her pace steady, her gaze forward, as if the words had never reached her. But inside her mind, every syllable settled into place with growing clarity. And as she entered the kitchen, she allowed herself a single controlled breath, because what she had just heard confirmed everything. This was not over, not even close. It was evolving, adapting, moving forward under a different shape. And Angela reached for a glass of water, her hand steady as she filled it, the sound of running water grounding her in the moment while her thoughts moved carefully ahead, mapping possibilities, anticipating outcomes. Because if Vanessa was adjusting, then something had interrupted the original plan, something unexpected, something Daniel had set in motion before his death. And that meant there was more information, more protection, more evidence, waiting somewhere within reach. And as the water settled in the glass, Angela turned it slightly, watching the reflection ripple across its surface, because clarity, she knew, never came all at once. It revealed itself in fragments, in small details that others overlooked, and she had already seen one of those details earlier, that single word on Vanessa's phone, delay, and now she had heard it again, spoken, confirmed, repeated, and repetition meant urgency, meant coordination with someone else, someone who had not been in that room, someone who was still involved. And as Angela set the glass down, she glanced toward the hallway, listening as Vanessa's voice faded into silence, the call ending with a soft click, followed by the sound of a door opening, footsteps approaching, measured, composed, returning to the version of herself the world expected, and Angela did not turn immediately. She allowed Vanessa to enter the room first, to step back into the role of the grieving widow, to re-establish the illusion that nothing had changed, because illusions, Angela realized, were strongest when no one challenged them. And for now, she had no intention of doing that. "I spoke with the attorney again," Vanessa said calmly, her voice smooth, controlled. "There are a few things we need to review this afternoon," and Angela nodded once, her expression neutral, her tone steady. "Of course," she replied, and in that simple exchange something unspoken passed between them, a quiet acknowledgement that both were playing roles now. Both were choosing their words carefully, both were waiting, but only one of them understood the full weight of what was at stake. And as Vanessa turned away, already moving on to the next step of her plan, Angela remained still for just a moment longer, her gaze steady, her thoughts aligned with a new and precise understanding. She was no longer searching for truth, she was following a trail, and the next piece was already closer than Vanessa realized. The afternoon light shifted slowly across the hardwood floors, stretching long shadows that moved inch by inch as if marking time in a way no clock could, and Angela Brooks stood just inside Daniel's study once again, her presence quiet, deliberate, as she let her eyes move across the room with new purpose, because this was no longer a place of memory, it was a place of answers. And somewhere within these walls Daniel had left something behind, something intentional, something that Vanessa had not yet found, and Angela moved toward the desk, her fingers brushing lightly against the surface, feeling the faint impressions left by objects that had once been there, a habit Daniel had always had, keeping things in precise order, never random, never careless, and that meant whatever he had hidden would follow a pattern, not chaos. And as she opened the top drawer, she found nothing unusual, neatly arranged documents, pens aligned, a leather notebook untouched, but Angela did not rush, did not search blindly. She paused, listening, because the house had its own rhythm, its own signals, and in the distance she could hear Vanessa moving through another room, her footsteps steady, her voice faint as she spoke again on the phone, lower this time, more cautious, and Angela closed the drawer softly, shifting her attention to the bookshelf against the far wall, where Daniel kept items he rarely discussed, personal records, older files, things that did not belong in the digital world. And as she ran her fingers along the spines, one section stood out, slightly misaligned, just enough to break the pattern, and Angela pulled the book forward, revealing a small, concealed compartment behind it, something she had never seen before, something Daniel had never mentioned. And inside, there was a single envelope, plain, unmarked, yet placed with deliberate care, and Angela held it for a moment, feeling its weight, understanding immediately that this was not accidental, this was meant to be found, but not easily. And as she opened it carefully, she found a thin stack of printed pages, financial records, timestamps, transaction summaries that connected names she did not immediately recognize, along with a smaller folded note in Daniel's handwriting, precise, unmistakable. "If anything feels wrong, follow the dates, not the people." And Angela read the line twice, letting the meaning settle, because Daniel had always trusted patterns over appearances, and now he was telling her to do the same. And as she flipped through the documents, she began to see it, small irregularities, transfers made just hours apart, accounts linked indirectly through third parties, movements that would appear normal unless viewed together, unless aligned by time rather than identity. And Angela's focus sharpened, her mind moving faster now, connecting pieces that had once seemed unrelated, because this was not random, this was structured, and structure meant intention. And then she heard it, the faint sound of Vanessa's footsteps approaching the hallway outside. Closer now, and Angela did not panic, did not rush. She folded the documents smoothly, returning them to the envelope before placing it back exactly where she had found it, aligning everything with careful precision, because nothing could appear disturbed, nothing could suggest discovery. And as the study door opened slowly, Vanessa stood there, her expression calm, her presence controlled. "I was wondering where you went," she said softly, her eyes scanning the room for just a fraction of a second before settling on Angela, and Angela turned toward her with the same composed calm she had maintained all day. "Just taking a moment," she replied, her tone steady, and for a brief second the silence between them carried more weight than any words, because now Angela knew something Vanessa did not, and that knowledge had shifted everything, quietly, invisibly, but completely. And as Vanessa stepped further into the room, Angela realized the truth had already begun to surface, not all at once, but piece by piece, exactly as Daniel had intended. Vanessa did not step fully into the room at first. She lingered just past the doorway as if measuring something unseen, her eyes moving briefly across the desk, the shelves, the exact spaces where Angela had just been, and Angela felt that quiet scan without reacting, her posture relaxed, her expression neutral, because this was no longer about what was visible, it was about what was suspected, and suspicion required patience. "Michael mentioned we may need to organize Daniel's personal records," Vanessa said gently, her tone carefully balanced between helpful and curious, as she finally stepped inside, her heels soft against the floor, and Angela gave a small nod, turning slightly toward the window as if the light outside held more interest than the conversation. "That makes sense," she replied, her voice even, controlled, offering nothing more, and for a moment the two women stood in the same space, surrounded by the remnants of a life that neither of them was viewing the same way. And Vanessa moved closer to the desk, her hand resting lightly on its edge, her gaze dropping for just a second before lifting again. "Daniel kept everything so precise," she added, her words measured, and Angela almost smiled at the accuracy of that statement, because precision was exactly what had led her to the hidden compartment, exactly what had revealed the first piece of truth. And now it was the same precision Vanessa was unknowingly stepping into. "He did," Angela said quietly, her eyes now returning to Vanessa, steady, observant, and in that brief exchange something shifted again, subtle, but undeniable, because Vanessa's confidence, while still present, was no longer untouched. There was a question beneath it now, a small but growing uncertainty that had not existed before the recorder, before the delay, before whatever Daniel had set in motion began to unfold. And as the silence stretched, Vanessa reached for a folder on the desk, opening it casually, flipping through pages with a practiced ease that suggested familiarity. But Angela noticed the details, the slight hesitation before turning each page, the quick glance at Angela between movements, the way her breathing changed just enough to reveal focus, not grief. And that was when Angela understood something new. Vanessa was not just maintaining control, she was searching, confirming, checking whether anything had changed without her knowledge, and that realization settled into Angela's mind with quiet certainty, because it meant the hidden compartment had not been discovered, not yet. And as Vanessa closed the folder and set it back exactly where it had been, she exhaled softly, her posture relaxing just enough to suggest reassurance. "I will have the staff begin organizing the documents this evening," she said calmly, stepping back toward the door, and Angela inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the plan without resistance. "That would be helpful," she replied, her tone unchanged, and as Vanessa turned to leave, her phone buzzed faintly in her hand, the screen lighting up just long enough to catch her attention. And this time Angela saw more than a single word. She saw the urgency in the way Vanessa's eyes narrowed, the way her fingers tightened slightly around the device. And though she could not read the full message, she did not need to, because the reaction said everything. Something had shifted again, something outside this house, something that required immediate attention. And Vanessa paused for just a second in the doorway before stepping out, her pace slightly quicker than before, her composure still intact but no longer effortless. And Angela remained where she was, her gaze steady, her thoughts moving with precise clarity, Because now the pattern was undeniable. This was not a single plan unfolding. It was multiple layers intersecting, adjusting, reacting to something they had not anticipated. And as the quiet returned to the study, Angela allowed herself one controlled breath. Because the advantage had shifted, not visibly, not completely, but enough to begin moving forward with intention, enough to know that whatever Vanessa was trying to protect was already beginning to slip beyond her control. Evening came quietly, the sky outside fading into a deep blue that pressed softly against the tall windows, and inside the house the lights turned on one by one, casting warm reflections that made everything appear calm, controlled, untouched. But Angela Brooks knew better now, because calm was no longer truth, it was cover. And as she stood near the staircase, her gaze drifting toward the front entrance, she heard it, the faint sound of the door closing, quicker than usual, followed by footsteps that did not pause, did not slow, moving with purpose rather than routine. And Angela remained where she was, not following, not calling out, because movement without awareness was still her strongest advantage. And seconds later the low hum of a car engine started outside, fading into the distance, and only then did Angela exhale slowly, her eyes narrowing just slightly as the pattern continued to unfold exactly as she had begun to expect. Vanessa was no longer simply managing appearances, she was reacting, and reaction meant pressure, and pressure meant something was breaking somewhere within her plan. And Angela turned without hesitation, moving back toward Daniel's study with steady steps, her mind already ahead of her, aligning pieces, tracing timelines, because Daniel had told her exactly what to do, follow the dates, not the people, and now it was time to see what that meant. And as she entered the study, she closed the door softly behind her, the click almost silent but deliberate, creating a space that felt separate from the rest of the house, isolated, focused. And she moved directly to the bookshelf, her hand finding the exact spot without searching, sliding the book aside to reveal the hidden compartment once more. And this time she removed the envelope completely, carrying it to the desk and opening it fully under the lamplight, the soft yellow glow illuminating the pages as she spread them out in careful order. And now, without distraction, without interruption, she began to study them the way Daniel would have, not as isolated entries, but as a sequence. And the dates began to align, transactions occurring within precise intervals, sometimes within minutes of each other, across accounts that seemed unrelated on the surface, but when viewed together formed a pattern that was far too structured to be coincidence. And Angela's focus sharpened as she traced one sequence after another, her finger moving lightly across the page as she followed the timeline. And then she saw it, a recurring point, a specific date that appeared again and again. Not identical transactions, but connected movements that all intersected within the same narrow window of time. And Angela leaned slightly closer, her breath steady, her attention absolute, because that date was only 3 days before Daniel's death. And as she flipped to the next page, the pattern continued, leading forward, not backward, extending beyond that point, continuing into the days after. And Angela felt a quiet shift settle into her chest, because that meant the activity had not stopped when Daniel died. It had continued, adjusted, adapted, exactly like Vanessa's behavior, exactly like the whispered conversation, exactly like the message she had seen, delay, and now the pieces aligned with undeniable clarity. This was not about inheritance alone. It was about something already in motion, something Daniel had discovered just before everything changed. And as Angela sat back slightly, her gaze moving across the spread of documents, one realization formed with sharp precision. Whatever Daniel had tried to stop had not ended with him. It had simply moved forward without him. And now, for the first time, Angela understood the full weight of what she was facing. This was not just about uncovering the truth. It was about stepping into a plan that was still unfolding, still active, still dangerous in ways she had not yet fully seen. And as the quiet of the study settled around her once more, Angela reached for her phone, not to call, not yet, but to record, to document, to prepare, because whatever came next would not be revealed by accident. It would have to be uncovered step by careful step. And now she knew exactly where to begin. The house remained quiet long after the sound of the car had disappeared, but this time the silence felt different, not empty, not still, but charged with something unseen moving beneath the surface. And Angela Brooks sat alone in the study with the documents spread before her, her phone placed carefully beside them, recording every detail as she began organizing the pages into a timeline that made sense not just on paper, but in intention. And the more she aligned the dates, the clearer the pattern became. Transactions clustered around specific hours, repeated across different accounts, always followed by brief pauses, as if waiting for confirmation before continuing. And Angela leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing as the realization formed. This was not just financial movement. This was communication, coded, structured, deliberate, and it extended beyond Daniel's final days, continuing into the present, which meant whoever was involved was still active, still operating under the assumption that nothing had changed, and that assumption, Angela understood, was now her advantage. And as she reached for the final page, a small notation caught her attention, something different from the rest, a location reference, not an address, not a name, just a sequence of numbers that aligned with one of the transaction times. And Angela paused, her fingers resting lightly on the paper as her mind worked through the connection, because Daniel had never left. Unnecessary details. Every mark had purpose, and this one pointed somewhere specific, somewhere physical. And as that thought settled, Angela's phone vibrated softly against the desk, breaking the stillness just enough to shift her focus. And when she glanced at the screen, she saw a name she had not expected, Michael Carter, calling again. And for a brief moment Angela considered letting it ring, letting the silence hold. But instinct told her otherwise, so she answered, her voice calm, controlled. Yes, she said simply. And on the other end there was a pause, as if Michael was choosing his words carefully. Mrs. Brooks, he began, his tone lower than before, more deliberate. There is something you should be aware of. And Angela did not interrupt, did not react. She simply listened, because listening had become her most powerful tool. After leaving your home, I reviewed the amendment again. He continued, there is an additional clause that was not discussed earlier, one that requires a secondary verification process. And Angela's gaze returned to the documents in front of her, her mind already anticipating what that might mean. Verification of what? She asked quietly, and Michael hesitated just long enough to confirm the weight of what he was about to say. Verification of cause, he replied, and the words settled into the room with quiet force, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. And Angela felt the final piece begin to align, because Daniel had not just prepared for uncertainty, he had prepared for doubt, and doubt required proof, and proof required exposure. And as Michael continued speaking, outlining the legal implications, the process that would follow, the need for discretion, Angela's attention shifted inward, focusing not on the explanation, but on the opportunity it created, because this was no longer just about uncovering a hidden pattern. It was about bringing it into the light at exactly the right moment. And as the call ended, Angela placed the phone back on the desk with careful precision, her gaze steady, her thoughts clear, because now she understood the full structure of what Daniel had left behind, a system designed not just to protect his assets, but to reveal the truth when the time was right. And that time, Angela realized as she gathered the documents into a single, organized stack, was approaching faster than anyone else in that house could possibly see. The next morning did not wait for anyone to be ready. It arrived with quiet precision, the kind that does not ask permission, and Angela Brooks stood in the main living room as sunlight filtered through the tall windows, illuminating a space that now felt less like a home and more like a stage where something inevitable was about to unfold, and everything had been set in motion with careful intention, not rushed, not forced, but aligned. And at exactly 9:30, the front door opened once again, Michael Carter stepping inside with the same composed authority as before. Only this time there was something different in the air, something heavier, something that suggested this was no longer just a meeting. And Vanessa appeared moments later, her expression calm, her posture flawless, her voice smooth as she greeted him. But Angela noticed it immediately, the effort behind the composure, the slight delay before each response, the careful control of every movement, because now Vanessa was no longer simply managing appearances, she was anticipating exposure, and that anticipation was beginning to show. And as they gathered once more in Daniel's study, the documents placed neatly on the desk, the recorder set beside them. The atmosphere tightened with quiet expectation, and Michael did not waste time with formalities, his tone direct, measured, as discussed. "The verification process has been initiated," he said, placing a new set of documents forward. "And based on the findings so far, there are inconsistencies that require clarification." And the word hung in the air, clarification, not accusation, not yet, but close enough to shift the balance completely. And Vanessa remained still, her hands resting lightly together, her gaze steady, but Angela saw it, the tension beneath the surface, the calculation adjusting in real time. "What kind of inconsistencies?" Vanessa asked calmly, her voice controlled. But this time there was a faint edge, a precision that suggested she already knew the answer she was about to hear, and Michael glanced briefly at Angela before continuing, as if acknowledging her silent presence in the process. "Financial movements linked to specific dates that align with Mr. Brooks' final week," he said, "as well as communication patterns that suggest coordinated activity." And Angela did not move, did not speak, because this was not her moment to lead. It was her moment to confirm, and Vanessa's eyes shifted, just slightly, toward the documents, toward the recorder, toward the space where everything was beginning to converge. And for the first time since the funeral, the illusion cracked in a way that could not be hidden, not completely, not anymore. And Michael reached for the recorder, pressing play with the same deliberate control as before. But this time it was not Daniel's voice that filled the room. It was another recording, quieter, shorter, unmistakable, the whisper Angela had captured at the gravesite. Clear and undeniable. "Speed up the inheritance. I am putting her next." And the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was final, because now the words existed outside memory, outside interpretation, fixed in a form that could not be denied. And Angela watched as Vanessa's composure faltered for the first time. Not dramatically, not completely, but enough to reveal the truth behind the performance. And in that moment, everything aligned exactly as Daniel had intended: the pattern, the delay, the verification, the exposure. And as the room held that silence, thick and irreversible, Angela understood one final thing with absolute clarity. This was not the end of the plan. This was the moment it revealed itself. And from here, there would be no returning to what it once was. No one moved immediately after the recording ended, because movement would have broken something that had finally settled into undeniable truth. And Angela Brooks remained exactly where she was, her posture calm, her expression composed. But now there was no longer any need to hide what she understood, because the room itself had shifted beyond illusion, and Vanessa stood across from her, still, silent, her eyes fixed on the recorder as if it might somehow change what had just been heard. But it did not. It could not, because truth, once spoken clearly, does not return to silence. And Michael Carter closed the device with quiet precision, his gaze steady as he looked between them, no longer observing, but confirming. "The verification process will continue," he said, his voice firm. But at this point, the conditions of the estate remained fully restricted, and the words carried weight, not as a threat, but as a final boundary that could not be crossed. And Vanessa finally exhaled, a slow, controlled breath that seemed to gather what remained of her composure. "This proves nothing," she said quietly, her tone measured, but no longer effortless, because effort was now visible in every word, every pause, every glance. And Angela turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting Vanessa's fully for the first time, without restraint, without pretense. And there was no anger in it, no raised voice, no accusation, only a steady clarity that did not need to be explained, because everything that needed to be said had already been revealed, not by her, but by the pattern Daniel had left behind. And the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was resolved. And as Vanessa stepped back slightly, her posture tightening, her control no longer complete, Angela understood something final. This had never been about confrontation, it had been about timing, about allowing truth to arrive in its own form, undeniable, structured, impossible to dismiss. And now that it had, nothing else needed to be forced. And Michael gathered the documents with deliberate care, his movements signaling the close of something more than a meeting. And Angela turned away from the desk, not in retreat, but in completion, because her role in this moment was finished. And as she walked toward the doorway, the light from the hallway falling across the floor in clean, quiet lines, she felt no urgency, no need to look back, because what had been hidden was no longer hidden, and what had been planned without her knowledge had now unfolded in a way no one else could control. And as she stepped out of the study, leaving the room behind with its silence and its exposed truth, one thought remained, clear and steady, not spoken, not announced, but understood in its entirety. Some people believe control comes from what they can take, but real control comes from what cannot be hidden once it is revealed.